It felt like pretending. It felt like I was really invisible. It felt frustrating that when people related to me, they were relating to what I considered to be a false image of myself.
When she was born, Susan Stryker's parents thought they were welcoming a baby boy into the world, but she knew they were wrong by the time she was 5 years old. It took decades to let them know who she really was, however. Being trans raised a lot of questions for Susan. Practical questions, of course, but also theological, philosophical, and historical questions. And thanks to decades of research, Susan Stryker is one of the foremost specialists on transgender history in the United States. In this episode of Fireside with Blair Hodges, Susan Stryker joins us to talk about her personal experiences and how they intersect with the story she tells in her path-breaking book, Transgender History. Susan Stryker, thanks for joining me today at Fireside. It's a real treat to have you here.
Hey, Blair, it's actually a great pleasure to be here.
We're talking about your book, Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution. And this is one of the most important histories of transgender history that's been written, especially about the United States. And I think that the book itself could include itself as part of that history, in my opinion. You're an important part of transgender history yourself in doing this kind of research. So I wondered if it bothers you at all that people want to dig into your own personal background and experiences right away when they start talking to you about your research.
No, that's totally fine. My life is an open book, shall we say. I think, people can just learn a lot and relate to people differently when you have a personal story to hang it on. So I've always been very open about talking about what my journey has been.
Let's hear about it. Tell us about your experience as a trans woman, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I will say that I am one of those people who, as far back as my memory goes, into very early childhood, it's just like I thought of myself as a young person who was going to grow up to be like mommy. Like that was just how I felt as a kid. And as a very young child, say around like 5 years old, that's where I had the rude awakening of realizing that I lived in a culture that assigned people to, boy-girl categories based on genitals, and that genital difference was a biological thing. And so that was my little wake-up call of going like, I feel like this about myself. What does this mean that like I got this body, not that body? So it's always been a question for me, and
can I ask how a 5-year-old can even begin to wrap their head around that? Because as a cisgendered person, I never had that as a kid. So I just, it's hard to see what that would be like.
It wasn't like I had a technical sense of like the way gender works. I just had a set of feelings, it's just like I just felt myself to be the way that I was. There's a story that I've told a number of times about saying, I wasn't reading medical textbooks as a 5-year-old, but I did listen to the radio. And that there was a very popular song when I was that age, The Girl from Ipanema, which is still a popular song. But I just remember that song and projecting myself into it, like I was the tall and tan and young and lovely one who, hips swayed so, gentle like a samba. I can't remember exactly the words. And it's just like that was the me that I was going to grow up to be. I remember feeling that very, very clearly, that I knew what I identified with. Little kids don't have a sense of, the way biology works or the way that social categorization of bodies works. It's like, I didn't know anything about that, but I knew how I felt. I knew what I thought. I'm like that, not like this. Bodily difference doesn't mean so much when you're, a kid. It's like you don't know what it means that you've got this body, not that body. But that recognition, around 5-ish years old for me, where it's like, I was like, oh, it's like people's bodies are different from one another. And it's like people who have like those bodies are girls and people who have those bodies are boys. And I have this body. I don't feel like I'm a boy. Like, what's up with that? It's like that was as much as I knew as a 5-year-old. But I knew that as a 5-year-old. And it just really drives home to me, and this is a long time ago. I'm in my 60s now. That was back in the 1960s. But it just drives home for me now, like all of the, cultural hoopla and the culture wars about trans kids, and how can kids know that? And this is just a fad, and this is,
they're being pressured into it. It's like a cool thing.
Being pressured into it, and I can just say, straight up testifying, just like I knew that about myself as a kid. So I believe it when kids that age or younger persistently express a cross-gender identification. However you want to explain it, how does it happen? Why does it happen? It's like, that's fodder for conversation. It's like people can talk, we can have a reasonable conversation about it. But the fact that it happens, it's just like incontrovertible. It's like it happens.
So for you, how did it start to spill out into everyday life, and did you get pushback as a kid? What were your experiences with that?
I really hit it, just like it was like a, uh-oh, like what's going on with this? Should I say something about this? It's like, but like you get lots of informal messages from the world,
tons of reinforcement,
that
even
gender
to
crossing behavior is something that
clothes,
is
colors,
frowned upon, or is like ridiculed or stigmatized. I mean, just like watching television, it's just like guy in a dress, yuck, 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 yuck.
Bugs Bunny kind of stuff,
right? Or knowing that you would get disciplined, like, honey, don't wear that, wear this, don't act that way, don't act this way. And so there's that constant low level norming of gender behaviors that you experience. And so like, should you say something to mommy and daddy? What if you like feel like, but wait, why are you like wanting to be more boy-like? I don't really feel that way. It's like, that's a hard conversation to have as a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old with your parents.
Especially maybe then and you grew up, I didn't know this about you. I found this out when I reached out to you, that you grew up in an RLDS with an RLDS mother. Now, I'm a Latter-day Saint, Mormon background. So this is a different church that sort of broke off. These are sister churches, we could even call them. So did that play a part? Like, did your family have religious values that conflicted with this?
They did, and that was also part of it. It's like, I was supposed to be like, like groomed for the priesthood, and I would have certain roles, and my transness planted questions about religion for me. It's kind of like, well, either I am misunderstanding myself somehow, or the received, information that I'm getting from my mom's faith tradition is like wrong somehow, or at an even deeper level, it's like, if this is all true, it's just like, I got something to say to God, because it's like, this isn't anything I chose about myself.
Yeah.
This is just how I am. And my transness is something that definitely planted questions for me about, let's call it cosmology, or like the ultimate nature of reality and truth.
Speaking of truth, I don't know how RLDS kind of arrival at truth, I don't know exactly how it worked culturally. Within my upbringing, it was that we're supposed to pray, seek answers to prayers, listen to authorities, there were scriptures and prophets, but also get confirmation of that. And so there was the sense that we are kind of an authority that we are supposed to rely on how we feel about things. And so it seems like
still small voice. Right?
Yeah, right. So it seems like a conflict for you is to have a religious tradition that's saying, trust yourself, listen to how you feel, but also saying, except you're not supposed to feel like that, and that part doesn't count. That fight that.
Right. And what I can say about the religious side of my upbringing is that because of my feelings of being trans and my questions about like, what does this mean? Like, how do I deal with this? Like, will the feelings go away? Can I study this and learn an answer of some kind through my studies that will like resolve this question in my mind? Or should I transition? Like, what's the story? What would that mean? I never felt it was bad or wrong, just like I just always felt, well, this is just how I am. This is fine. This has got to be okay. And if it's not okay, it's like, I got something to say to that guy upstairs, because it's like, this is like something that was handed to me, and so, yeah, like I said, it raised all kinds of questions in my mind about what is the right thing to do and how to move forward. And, I think being trans planted the seeds of my intellectualism. It's like it made me want to research and, ask historical kinds of questions, because even as a kid, when I was starting to learn, I would say around age 10, that hormones and surgery were a possibility, it's like it planted the historical question in my mind of, it's like, I feel this way about myself. I would certainly like to take hormones and reshape my body shape. But before that was possible, it's like before they discovered hormones or like had anesthesia, it's like, did people who felt the way that I do, it's like, what did they do? How did they deal with it? So there was that historical question in my head of like, could somebody like me have existed in the past? Or if somebody had the feelings that I had at a time before, current trans medicine was available, it's like, what would they do? That's a really interesting historical question. But the religious questions, I would say it steered me towards having a more intellectual rather than more fundamentalist kind of outlook. That wasn't like, well, it says this in the Bible, so that must be true. It sort of led me in the direction of going like, well, it's like there's many different ways that like scripture could be interpreted. And, and I've studied religion. I actually wrote my dissertation on early Mormon history and, know a reasonable amount about not only that, but, broader history of religion. And that, I knew there were like many different intellectual traditions in both, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, about what's the relationship of the people who are people of the book to like the books that they are people in relationship to, different hermeneutic and heuristic traditions, different relationships to scripture, different like intellectual questions about how does any like particular set of religious beliefs relate to philosophical or cosmological questions? So I just had this sense as an adolescent growing up in the faith tradition that my family was a part of, that I was part of its intellectual wing somehow, and maybe like, people I'd hear at church preaching about something. It's like, well, maybe I was a, snotty little smart ass kid, thinking like, I know better than they do. And it's just like, and, I'm going to like get a college education and I'm going to learn all of this and I'm going to learn. It's like, and then by the time I got into my later teens and early 20s, I really realized that there wasn't much of what I would think of as like a progressive intellectual tradition that was available to me through the RLDS tradition.
Right.
Although, I will say too that, that even though I have had religious questions and doubts, since I was in my early adolescence, even though I no longer practice and, don't consider myself a member of the LDS communities of faith, even though I felt like I was not able to find a home in that tradition, I respect the way that they have continued to evolve as a church, as an institution, that they started admitting women to the priesthood, or we should like approach the Book of Mormon as something that you don't have to think of as being literally true.
And affirm queer relationships and stuff now, too. The Community of Christ, whereas the Salt Lake-based LDS Church hasn't taken any of those moves, Yeah. Did that affect you at all, too? Because the Community of Christ was more progressive and sort of moving in those directions.
Than the LDS Church,
But you were already kind of like disconnecting at that point, or?
Yeah, I was. Like this was back in the 60s and 70s, like I have not had any active involvement with the church probably since around like 1979, 80 or so. But, I have family members who are still actively involved. It's like I have both an aunt and an uncle, both departed as of, the present, who were both members of the priesthood. My family history is like, very much connected with the RLDS tradition, but I said I'm not actively a part of it and haven't been for decades.
Do you think being trans was a big contributor to that, or is it a general intellectual bent and other things?
Yeah, I do think my being trans contributes to me not being part of that community. Like I remember as an adolescent when, I don't want to say getting pressured, but there were people in the priesthood who were saying, like, we've received a priesthood call for you, and it's like you should be ordained, it's whatever. I'm going like, yeah, I don't think so, because
and they didn't ordain women yet, right? At that point, yeah.
Right.
So.
It was kind of like, I just think this is not the right thing for me. And there was a lot of questions like, oh, but you have such leadership potential, and you can whatever. And it's like, yeah, but there's the thing that I'm not telling you, which is that you're thinking I'm a guy and I'm not. And so, yeah, that was basically it.
What did transitioning look like for you then?
Well, I didn't transition until I was 29, 30. But I knew about myself early on. By the time I was in my teens, I really felt like I needed to come out to people that I was romantically or, sexually attracted to. And I've always been oriented towards women. I'm a trans lesbian.
Okay.
And that it's like the women who were interested in me, they were interested in me because they thought I was a guy. Maybe the things that they liked about me were like, oh, like there's something different about you. You're not like the other guys. And it's like, yeah, if I could only tell you more.
Yes.
But, I do feel like there was something that, a number of people that I dated found attractive about me, or, not at a physical level, but just sort of at an emotional relationship level. But, it would always get to that point of going like, this feels false to me, or they would do something that I perceived as homophobic or transphobic, and going like, yeah, they're not sort of down for this. All right. And things would drift away. But by the time I was in my late teens, I just thought, what I need to do is like, I need to find like bisexual women to be involved with, like people who like are totally okay about eroticizing a same-sex relationship but are not put off by male anatomy.
Well, and they also haven't been part of the binary, maybe there's not the same kind of hang-ups because they're not typically, they're not heterosexual.
Exactly, and that I thought, like let me like find people like that and come out early in the relationship and see how it goes. And but
did you know that you would transition, though, at that point?
Well, it was I would say that I knew how I felt about myself, but I wasn't sure exactly what I would do, and finding in my late teens somebody to be with that I was open with, who accepted me, and it's like it was part of how we related to each other in our intimate relationships. It's like, to me, like that felt great. It's kind of like, wait, you see me as a person, we understand each other, we're relating to each other, and maybe I don't need to do anything physical. We had a child together, so it's like that was also a consideration for me.
So more than just like figuring out this category and taking these exact steps, it sounds like the relationship that you could build was really what you were seeking after. However, body changes or hormones or whatever else, like you needed a safe place.
Right. And I feel like by my late teens, early 20s, I'd certainly found something that was more satisfying than what, I had known as a teenager or, young adolescent.
Yeah.
But it also became clear to me very quickly, well, I don't say very quickly, it eventually became clear to me that it was not enough, that it meant the world to me that I had a partner who recognized me, but then I had a son who didn't know this about me, and I had friends and colleagues, and I just thought, this isn't just who am I to myself, who am I to my intimate partner. It's like who am I to anybody who's significant about me? How am I in the world? How do I relate to the world? And I just felt like I could not continue down that path living as a man.
Did it just feel like pretending all the time?
It felt like pretending. It felt like I was really invisible. It felt frustrating that when people related to me, they were relating to what I considered to be a false image of myself, not like who I really was. And so it just felt very isolating. It felt very alone. Sometimes I would think about like, this is like some science fiction movie where like, I'm a little consciousness like operating some, rock'em sock'em robot out there. It's kind of like, it's like, there's this body that looks the way that it looks in the world, and I'm inside here, manipulating it and making it go and speaking through its mouth. But it's like, what people are seeing is not actually me, and that I just sort of wanted to be present, be, to manifest.
So that's what you did. You mean then you made choices to do it.
Yeah, I was held in place for a number of years by that relationship that I was in, and and I have great compassion for my ex-partner. What I realized was that I was her closet. That she was somebody who had queer feelings, who was oriented towards women, but actually came from a very homophobic family, and that she found in me something that felt emotionally right but passed as straight in the world. Right. And every time I would go like, I just don't think I can do this anymore, she would freak out because it would be like outing her. Right. And I just like tried for a number of years because there was so much at stake. I mean, not just the relationship, but our child. Yeah, right. Who, I will say to your audience, is just fine, is 38 years old now, is a, happy, healthy, well-adjusted adult human being who came from a queer trans family. Kids are all right. Yes. No damage there that I know of, other than the routine.
Come on, yeah, I was gonna say child, we all like, damage in some ways our kids.
It's like, honey, I'll pay for therapy, whatever you need. But we get along great, and he's got a good relationship with both of his parents. But yeah, I eventually just got to the point of saying like, I got to put this burden down. I've got to like be who I am in the world and let the chips fall where they may. And it's been wonderful, honestly. I mean, it was hard, it was hard. I mean, there's employment discrimination, there's stigma, there's, I lost relationships over people's like ignorance or prejudice or freak out. But by and large, everybody who really mattered to me is still with me. Family feels strong, and I have an amazing network of friends and colleagues. I've had long-term relationships with people. The partner I'm with now, I've been with for more than 25 years.
What did that coming out process look like? Because now I'll see people maybe talk about it on social media or send an email around to their family. Like, what was your coming out process like at that moment in time?
Oh, gosh. It's multifaceted because, I felt like I needed to manage the flow of information about my transition with work and career. Like I was at the tail end of graduate school. I was finishing up my dissertation the year that I was like deciding to transition. Wow. And I just thought, I didn't really trust that my dissertation director would, do the right thing or be cool about it all. So I was already like socially and hormonally transitioning in my life, but wasn't letting my university or my advisors know about it yet. So I was sort of living a double life for about a year in there. And then after I finished the dissertation, had the title page signed, degree was awarded, like it was done. It was in the can. The very next day I went in and filed a petition to change the name on the title page of my dissertation, which was, it's your dissertations don't have, gender markers on them. They just have your name, but it's just like, as soon as I actually had degree in hand, I filed the name change. But then in my social world, it's like I said, it was kind of bifurcated. There were people that I knew in the San Francisco queer community who like I was out to as trans for like from the late 80s forward. I definitely had a queer and trans community, but I also had this whole world of family and academia that didn't know this about me. So my coming out process was really one of sort of integrating the two, of coming out to people I wasn't out to yet. And, by and large, it's like people were maybe shocked or curious or surprised. But for the most part, people in my community stuck with me. And then with my family, I remember telling my son, who was 8 at the time, and I said, look, I want to tell you something about why, your mom and I have broken up and aren't living together. And it's just that I don't think there's anything wrong with being a boy. You're a boy, and that's a totally fine way to be, but I've never really felt like one, and it makes me feel really unhappy. And so I decided that I'm going to change and be a woman. And he's, as a precocious little 8-year-old, he says, humans can do that? I knew it was possible in some fish,
In fish.
Because, and I said, well, humans and fish do it in different ways, but you're right. Some fish change sex over the course of their lives. And that just kind of like happens for various reasons, but I'll have to do this on purpose.
Yeah.
And he was listening. And then he said, so I'm going to have 2 moms. Cool. And I thought, all right, he's okay. He's okay about this. And he has been. Coming out to the rest of my family, when I told my mother, it's like I was waiting. I was waiting to publicly transition and change my name and gender markers and sort of how I dressed and all that until I came out to my mom. And I told her, I said, look, I want to come home for a visit. I'd like for us to spend a day together. I've got some big news that I want to tell you. She said, what, are you all right? I said, I'm fine. I'm fine. It's just, big news that I want to tell you. So I went for a family visit. She said like, oh, I actually have to go into work this morning, but like, let's talk at lunch. And, when I told her, I just said, okay, Mom, I'm just going to like lay it out. I have always felt that I'm transsexual and I'm going to change gender, pretty much as soon as I get back to San Francisco. And how are you doing with that? And she says, well, I thought you were going to tell me that you were gay and HIV positive, so I guess this is good news.
Wow, yeah.
And I said, I told you, I said that I would consider being HIV positive bad news. I mean, not
sure,
like it's
a real health issue, yeah.
Right, but I said I would consider that bad news. But I just said it's big news. And so it's like, yeah, it's a big change. And I just told her a little bit more about stuff going on in my life. And I said, how are you doing with this, Mom? And she says, I'm in complete denial. You can tell me anything right now, and told her a little bit more. And then, she said, well, I actually have to go back to work and finish something up before the end of the day. But why don't you just go to my closet, find anything that you like that fits you? Why don't you just take it? And then, like we can go like shopping to replace all of that or buy some things that you want.
Oh, wow.
It's like, okay, got to go, And so that was Mom, that she, I don't think she ever quite got it. I don't think she totally understood it, but she was a fierce mama bear of a mother who like loves her kids and totally has their back in all ways, shapes, forms, and fashions. And yeah, she never abandoned me, and she was always very supportive. And before she died, this was in 1992 and 3 that I was coming out to her. And she was with us on this earth until 2020.
Oh, wow.
But in her later years, I mean, she told me, many times that she was proud of me and of what I had done with my life. And she was totally accepting of my life. And as it turns out, one of my brother's kids came out as trans in high school. He's transitioned now, too. So it's like, it's a family affair.
Wow, yeah. I have to say, as a parent, I've thought about the possibility of this with my own children, and the two things that come to mind, and I confess, like, this is, for me, it doesn't feel great to say this out loud, but I'm really would love to hear your feedback on this, is if my child had a conversation like that with me, and I think it would probably happen relatively early on, this is more common these days, the two things that I would think about are, number one, I did have like sort of hopes and dreams about, or not even maybe hopes and dreams, but just expectations, cultural expectations about what this child is, and gender and sex are part of all that, and that would be hard to let go of in some ways as a parent, number one. And then number two, really just a concern and a fear that this child will face difficulties and prejudice. And so I would want to, personally, I'm in a place where I've known enough trans people and really learned about it enough to be accepting of this, and not like that needs my acceptance in the sense of like making it right or anything, but just like I could be okay with it. But that would be hard still, though. I was thinking, you've got maybe some things you're going to have to face, and that makes me sad.
Yeah, well, I think you hit both nails right on the head. Like those are the two big parental concerns, that you want your kids to thrive in life because you love them and you want them to have like enriching, rewarding lives, at the emotional level. You want them to find people to love and be loved by. You want them to feel like they're going to have some success in what they do, or some happiness, some contentment in their life. And, when you see those things out there in the world that could be stumbling blocks for that, it's like, your parent's heart, it's like goes, I hope they're okay, and what can I do to smooth the path?
Yeah.
I totally get that. And, I can say it's like I have had a very self-fulfilling life as a trans person. I feel like even though it complicated things, even though I have definitely experienced prejudice and discrimination, I have been able to work with that and to have a life that feels very livable to me, a life worth living. And I think the stigma and prejudice, discrimination that came with like being out as trans, particularly early in the transition, before I kind of like got more fully reestablished in my life. It's like, it's real, it definitely slows you down, but it also teaches you things if you survive it, And I totally value the experience that I gained. I think it sharpened my political sensibilities. I think it created more empathy for me. I think it required me to learn different skills, to live my life than I would have needed to learn otherwise. And, I have zero regrets about the transition. It is just what needed to happen. It's what I needed to do to stay alive as me. And I'm just so thankful of the people in my community who came along on the journey with me. There's a survey that takes place generally once every 5 years, like the National Transgender Health Survey, that shows that the single greatest predictor of how well trans people are going to do post-transition is whether or not they've been abandoned by their families of origin. It's like that is the most important safety net for helping people make the social transition and not fall through the cracks and wind up someplace they don't want to wind up. So, again, if I'm preaching today, it's like telling the parents of trans kids or telling the family members of, adult transitioners, it's like, do not abandon your loved ones. It's like, maybe it's not what you were expecting of their life, but it is a life worth living. And, at some level, I think it's no different than any other major change. Like your kid tells you, it's like, oh, I'm getting divorced, and like you really liked their, their ex, or they said, you know what, I've decided that I'm going to become a Buddhist monk and go live in a monastery. And you go like, but wait, it's like, where am I going to see you?
Yeah.
So any kind of major life change like that is hard. So, I just appreciate your honesty and saying like, I had gendered expectations for what my child would be, and I need to reset my expectations. And that's your work to do, right? It's like, it can be very pleasurable. It's like oh, here is this person I know so well, my child.
I like that you said that in kind of in the introductory materials, where you say it's interesting that a lot of times the reaction that people tend to have, especially cisgendered people, when they find out that someone's trans, is either like revulsion or disgust or confusion or distaste or condemnation. And you say, why not curiosity?
Yeah. I think the deeper answer to that is when people who've never really thought about transness, either in like somebody that they care about or in themselves, is that it's just like it's kicking the ground out from under their feet. It's like, but wait, like I don't know how to relate to this person. Like the idea of gender being almost like a container, that holds your personhood. And when you like crack that container or say like, actually, it's like, I need a different container here for my sense of self that's shaped in a different gender. To encounter that, I think it can make the person who encounters the trans person afraid. It's kind of like, it's very disorienting, and it can result in reactive, defensive, aggressive kinds of, attitude or actions toward the trans person. I mean, it's why, I think so many men who discover that somebody they're like attracted to or maybe dating or just picked up is a trans woman, or like when that is like revealed, that there can be a very homophobic reaction. It's kind of like, you're like, what does this mean for me?
Right.
Like, what does it make me? It's like, it must kill you.
Yeah. Violence does result.
Violence does result out of that, panic in the person who encounters the trans person because of what they think it means about themselves.
Interesting.
So, it's still a problem, but I will say, I've seen a lot of change in the 30 plus years, since my own transition. Which I also want to say is not a one-time thing. It's not like a, one and done, hit it and quit it, You just change, just like
flipped a switch.
Transition is an ongoing process. I mean, everyone, humans, it's like we are not the same person tomorrow that we were yesterday. We are all changing.
Yeah, I've learned a lot from a friend, Kelly Potter, just seeing her relation to sports and stuff, that as she's transitioned and what hormone therapy has changed her relationship to her body in ways that that she couldn't have anticipated because she couldn't have experienced it. And so there's just a lot of factors that, as you said, this is like an ongoing process. I mean, she came out as trans a while ago and is still sort of learning about what this new body does and all the implications of it.
Exactly. And bodies don't stand still for any of us. And as I age, like I said, I was transitioning in my late 20s, early 30s, and now I'm in my early 60s. And there's a lot I notice about like ways bodies change, that actually have something to do with, metabolism and hormones and, fat distribution and muscle tone. It's just like there's all kinds of things that change about your body as you age. And I keep comparing those age-related changes to the gender transition-related changes, and like there's actually a lot of similarities there.
Interesting. And before we move on to the next section, we're going to get into some definitions about transgender. We're going to get into some of the history, but I wanted to ask one more personal question here. Is in the beginning of the book, you describe yourself, these different roles that you occupy: a historian, an activist, a cultural theorist, a media maker, and an academic who you say has tried to chronicle the various dimensions of transgender experience. And I wondered if any of those roles in particular are more comfortable for you, and if any of those are less comfortable for you, because when you're a trans person writing about trans issues, it almost seems like you kind of have to do some activism as you're doing that. So are any of these roles really more at home for you?
I think ultimately my deepest calling is as a storyteller, and so if I think about everything that I'm doing as storytelling, it's just different modalities, venues, audiences for telling stories about the world. And so I do feel very comfortable in that role. But it changes over time, right? It's like I got a PhD because I wanted to be a history professor, telling stories about the past. My transness really complicated that. I've never actually worked in a history department. It took me 15 years between PhD and professorhood, where I was working in the community. I ran the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco for a while. I was a filmmaker, still am a filmmaker.
An award-winning filmmaker.
And, I actually really love that kind of public-facing work. But I did eventually have a chance to enter the professoriate. And I kind of joke about it back in the 90s and early aughts to say, like, I'm never going to get a job as a professor until people that I knew as undergrads are now like tenured faculty members who want to hire me as a senior scholar in a field that I have helped, pioneer.
Right.
And it's exactly the way it played out.
Wow.
So around, I taught on and off as an adjunct while making my living in other ways.
You'd have to with adjuncting.
Yeah, I know. It's not a sustainable mode of life. But kind of kept my hand in. I published. I edited things. It's just like I still did scholarship, but I made my living in the nonprofit sector and as an independent filmmaker.
Right on. That's Susan Stryker, author of the book Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution, which we're talking about today. She's also professor emerita of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona and a founding co-editor of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. All right, so let's I know we're a ways into this now, but let's define transgender. You say that the word transgender itself has only come into widespread use kind of in the past few decades and that it's still under construction. So how do you use transgender in this book?
Right, Blair. The first documented instance of using a trans plus gender neologism, made up word in the English language is from 1965. So we had a medical doctor writing in this like handbook of mental health about what he was calling transsexualism, but then says, but actually it would be more accurate to call it transgenderism. So that was the first known use of the term.
And why did he make that distinction?
Well, maybe a quick thing to say about where the word gender came from. It's like wasn't until the late 1950s and early 1960s that social scientists and neuroscientists and endocrinologists, came up with this new conceptual system of like thinking about sex, gender, and identity. It's like the idea like sex is biological, gender identity is like what you think of yourself as, man or woman, and gender role is like how are you perceived socially, what social roles do you perform. And so that idea of sex, gender identity, gender role was like a new conceptual framework, new set of vocabularies in the late 50s and early 60s. Until that time, gender wasn't a word that people used to talk about bodies. It was a word that people used to talk about grammar and language, like nouns,
right.
Masculine, feminine, neuter, and that linguistic gender is just what are the rules by which we arbitrarily assign certain words to certain categories of words, so masculine, feminine, neuter. We have three genders in English, but other languages have no genders or many genders. But it's just basically gender as the arbitrary set of rules for how you treat all members of the same class of things in a similar way. And these scientists are like, well, that's actually like a good metaphor for talking about what we do with humans. It's like, how do we like categorize bodies into categories? How do we place bodies into categories? It's like that could be called like gendering. It's like you put an object in a gender of similarly treated things. So yeah, this book in 1965 was the first one to apply that new nomenclatural system or conceptual vocabulary to trans issues. But how I think about transgender, it's like you could think of it as an identity label. There are some people who are called transgenders, it's like it is a name for them. But I think of it in a different way. It's like I think of transgender as not being limited to a certain kind of people that gets a new name in the mid-1960s. I think of transgender as the practice of moving away from a socially assigned sex gender position, and that's really broad. It's moving away from something culture told you that you didn't pick for yourself, and you are moving away from that towards something else, towards some other gender, to move towards no gender, to move back and forth across the gender divide. That I think we can imagine transgender as this really expansive word for talking about all of the different ways that people transgenders. It's like, rather than an identity label, it's like it's a name for practices of moving away from a non-consensually assigned gendered starting place in life.
That really,
however one does it.
That was really helpful to me to see it as a process kind of term that doesn't have a set final destination or just set plastic identity or sort of like static identity, but rather a process that acknowledges that these roles are kind of socially constructed and that some people don't fit into those constructions, and therefore they seek that home. And it requires a journey. It requires exploration.
Yeah, and I think all of that, and I think of transgender as a big tent. There people in trans communities can really get their knickers in a twist about no, don't call me by that name, call me by this name. And transgender is really different than non-binary, and transgender is different than transsexual, and
genderqueer and other things. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like I usually actually don't use the word transgender. I'll just say trans,
right.
Just as a shorthand. And it's like anything that kind of troubles and unsettles and refigures gender, whatever you think that is, however you're doing it, let's just call it trans. Big tent. So that's the way that I look at it.
And I love that your book basically also says, hey, all of this is going to change, and you've really got to be plugged into the ongoing conversations, because these terms will change. Some will offend some people, others will offend other people. And so instead of throwing up our hands or being frustrated with that, I see your book as an invitation to just remain engaged and maybe not freak out so much. If you say the wrong thing, take correction or learn and just continue to grow.
Yeah, I'm glad you're taking that away from the book, because that is definitely my my hope, and it goes two ways, It's just I want to say to curious, well-intentioned, respectful cis people who are interested in trans for whatever reason, it's just as long as you're coming to this with a sense of respect for the other person and genuine open-minded curiosity, it's it's not good pedagogy to scold people about things they don't know, right? And so it's just I really want to model that sense of if it's a legit question and you just want to know, it's just I'm not gonna say you said that wrong, that just doesn't help. And
I get that too, though. It's pretty irritating.
Well, you can feel that way, and I think it's always fine to say actually I don't want to talk about that right now. Or it's kind of why don't you go ask somebody else, or say
right.
You know what, you don't have to ask me that question. There's this thing called the internet,
yes.
and there are search terms. It's why don't you Google something?
Yes.
Why don't you read a fact? It's just you can do that, but you can do it in a nice way.
Yeah.
But genuinely, for me, if somebody's asking me a question from a place of a real desire to know, and they're open to hearing something, it's I feel that's the teacher in me that
right.
wants to say, sure, let me answer that question for you. Here's my take on it. The flip side of the coin is I do feel sometimes in trans communities that I can be a person who's y'all just settle down a little bit, just chill out, just let's not lose our
That's
minds.
Going to irritate some people too, by the way, right? You probably irritate some people. They're hey, no, we got to really be vocal about this,
Yeah, well, it's but vocal about what? I mean, I really feel we are in it in terms of the cultural struggle right now. It's it is such a reactionary period.
Yeah.
It's so it's to, quote Ben Franklin from, back in the 18th century, if we don't all hang together, we're all going to hang separately here.
Yeah.
So
stick together.
Who's got your back? Who's on your side? It's you know what? It's I really couldn't care less if somebody said transgendered instead of transgender, or if somebody uses a word in the wrong way, or like kind of sort of doesn't really totally get what you're doing. It's like, basically, it's like, are we on the same side of this thing? Are we all part of the herd of cats that is vaguely going in the same direction towards some kind of alternative to the reactionary onslaught we are experiencing right now? And if the answer is yes, it's like, you know what? It's like, let's have a discussion over, a cup of tea later tonight about nomenclature, but I am not going to read you the riot act about it.
Do you have the same kind of attitude to like accidental or deliberate misgendering, where someone might say, oh, hello, sir, or, this type of thing?
Deliberate misgendering, I have no patience with, and I will totally get up on somebody's grill about that. But if it's just accidental, it's kind of like, give the person the benefit of the doubt, politely, generously, ask them to do something different, sort of explore that moment with them. But, but particularly if it's a family member, like you were saying earlier, it's like we have gendered scripts in our heads for the people that we love, and we think about them in a particular way, and it can just take time.
Even linguistically, the hardest thing for me is just how gendered. And if you stop and think about it, I'm seeing like people complain about, they're grooming kids by introducing them to the fact of different gender identities. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like we groom kids in the sense of instilling a belief in them about male and female, or boy and girl from the very beginning. And it's pervasive. Like we can't hardly refer to a person without it being about what we think their genitals are. And if you think about it, that's actually really weird.
It is, yeah. But, I'm glad you brought up the part about linguistics, because I do feel like, we become very habituated. And like, I think even our brains get wired in a particular way through repetition.
For sure.
That we internalize certain grammatical rules in our, neurological processes. And that it's like learning somebody's gendered pronoun and then asking them to change it. It's kind of like learning a different language that you haven't been habituated to speak.
Yeah, just from a pragmatist standpoint, I'm like, can't we just they everybody? But then again, I'm speaking from a place of privilege when I say something like that. But I just
it's interesting to me that like since at least the middle of the 19th century, there's many different efforts to introduce new pronouns into English. I mean, not even related to trans questions, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that English does not have what's called an epicene pronoun in the third person. It's like you can't talk about a person. You can say I, and that's not gendered. You can say you, and that's not gendered. So you're speaking of yourself, speaking directly to another person, but speaking of a person, referring to them without addressing them.
Right.
You've got he, she, and it.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
and now they, right? But that's pluralized, and that's what people would say is it's not a singular.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing for me is that you point to the they them question and the use of they as a singular, and I really think that's the way to go. It's like it's a word that we already use.
I lean on it a lot.
Already use the word they in colloquial speech.
Yep.
You can look back in the historical record, and there's the use of the word they for third person singular. I mean, in like Shakespeare and Chaucer, and it's like back to like the 1400s, 1300s. The thing that I've taken to doing in my classes, instead of doing the pronoun go round, like, okay, everybody say what your pronouns are, which I think can put trans and non-binary and gender questioning people on the spot, and that it becomes kind of, a hollow lip service kind of exercise. What I tell my students first day is to say, like, look, I am just going to call everybody they. It's like that's where we're going to start. And we're going to treat it like the formal and familiar distinction. It's just like, if I don't know you well enough to know what your pronoun preferences and uses are, I'm just going to call you they. That's where everybody's going to start out. And if you would like me to call you something else, then invite me. Invite me in to gender you in a more personal way.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of a fun little exercise to just practice that sense of like, why am I assuming that I know what that person's gender identity is? It's like, I see what their body looks like, but what's the relationship between what their body looks like and how they think of themselves? And so, I'm not going to get up in their business and say, hi, please tell me your pronoun. It's just like, I'm just going to like do that vague, formal they, them for everyone and let people come to me.
Now, you mentioned kind of back in early American history here. So back in the earliest days of colonial settlement, for example, you say that there have always been people who have contradicted social expectations about what was considered typical for women or for men, and that you find people in the records that don't quite fit these things. I learned a lot of new things here. Even, for example, I don't know why I hadn't realized this, but even the word transvestite, which is one of the earliest terms I think that we see in the historical record, literally meant like someone who's wearing different vestments, like vest. I don't know why I didn't even realize that that's what that was referring to.
Vestiments, yeah, transvestism. Yeah, but it's, I think, one of the most conceptually or theoretically interesting things about trying to do trans history is that when you look at the historical record, you can absolutely, unquestionably see a wide range of gender like styles and concepts of people who, I would say, transgender, but there's a very different conceptual vocabulary. It's like, how do you talk about transness before you have trans terminology? Like that's a kind of a interesting meta-historical question. And so there are definitely like terms that people used back in the day that got a trans angle to them, but they're like totally not in use today. I mean, like Molly, like Molly was a word in the 17th and 18th centuries for people we might call either effeminate homosexual men or trans women, depending on how we want to name them. But basically somebody with a male biology who Molly kind of meant like soft or woman-like, from the word, the Latin word, I'm going to mispronounce it, mulieribus, girl or woman. Like in Spanish, mujer, the word Molly, the slang word Molly, was related to that. And, people don't really... You don't use that word anymore, but it's like it was a word that was very specific to a time and place that arguably is a kind of trans-ish identity, or like the word tribade, which comes from a Greek word that means to rub, and that a tribade was somebody who was, as we would say now, assigned female at birth, who was oriented towards women. Another word describing people like that back in the day was confricatress. I love that one.
I've not heard any of these.
I know. So, right, because like vocabulary changes, conceptual
and were they negative
words
change. Too, though? Were these sort of like morally problematic?
Most of these were morally problematic words that were imposed from the outside upon people perceived to be deviant, but they were also words that people could take up for themselves, and particularly Mollies. People self-identified as Mollies. Yeah, so like I said, the language changes. The language changes over time. Terms come in and out of favor. Conceptual frameworks change, as well as particular words. But you can look in the historical record and see people who do things that look an awful lot like trans, what we call trans today. That I have a friend and colleague, the historian Jen Mannion, who has a book out in the last year called Female Husbands. And that, Jen just writes about, like, this term, female husbands, starts showing up in the middle of the 18th century, and it seems to fall out of favor in the early 20th century. So I just sort of want to do this history of like who were people who called themselves female husbands, like what was up with that. And what Jen winds up saying is like, I don't want to call these people, I don't want to say these are transgender people, but I do want to say that they are people who transgender.
Yeah, and I think the distinction there is, in disability studies, this was similar, where when people try to diagnose past historical figures and say, oh, was Mozart autistic or something like this, that category itself didn't exist in his context, and the way he was treated and thought of and the way he behaved was culturally conditioned such that what we think of today as autism in some ways didn't actually exist back then. We want to kind of think like that everything that exists today can just have this exact parallel in the past, but that's really not exactly how it works because the cultures have differences.
Yeah, there's a philosopher, cultural theory person named Ian Hacking. He actually does like a history and philosophy of science. But he writes about what he calls looping effects. And he's got this great article called Making Up People. And, the kind of the argument is that it's like, all right, let's talk about tuberculosis. We could certainly do a social history of tuberculosis, about how it's treated and how people understood it and what the scientific understanding was at the time, or what public health measures were taken, and how ideas about tuberculosis turn into policy or inform epidemics, yada, yada, yada. But whatever the human activities are there is still this thing called the tuberculosis, bacterium, regardless of what we're doing, right? It's like, and our way of thinking about it doesn't necessarily change that organism. But then when we're talking about human social categorization, there's a different order of problem that gets introduced, which is that ways that you think about things inform ways that people think about themselves, and you kind of get this looping effect where nobody would have used the word transgender before 1965, but kind of like once that word is out there, how are people taking that up and using it as a form of, self-interpretation? Going like, this thing about me that I know, it's like there is a word that kind of sort of fits for me, and you start relating yourself to it. And so that over time, there's this looping relationship that happens between how people think of themselves and existing ways of thinking about people. It's like it's a total like feedback loop, and so the historical question in there, like you raised the question about autism. I think that's exactly the right point to make. That there was something about Mozart that kind of sort of maps onto what we think about autism today, but didn't really, it's like that was not part of the milieu at his time. It wasn't how he thought of himself. And so you ask that question, it's like, is it a useful framework for thinking about Mozart through the category autism, or do you just want to say, I've learned from disability studies that, there's these sort of interesting kinds of conceptual and historical questions that we can get into. How do we talk about Mozart in a way that recognizes a potential neurodivergence without like anachronistically projecting contemporary terminology into a past where it's like it would be inappropriate to think about it that way.
Okay, as people approach this book, I want them to know it really does lay out this history sort of chronologically. We're introduced to a lot of developments in medical science and in psychology, and we meet pivotal figures who made discoveries, or who people who, again, kind of were they trans back then? People that were trans in the sense of being on a journey away from societal norms and things. And so I wanted to zoom in just on a few of these. One of them was Christine Jorgensen. This is a person who became, you say, the most famous transgender person in the world back in the 1950s, with news of her so-called sex change, right? This idea that she had a surgery to change this.
Yeah, she's really the person who popularized the concept of transsexuality. And I use the word transsexual to mean, a medicalized, hormones and surgery transition from man to woman or vice versa. Some people think that's a pejorative term now, that it came out of the medical establishment and it's always pejorative and never self-applied. But, I will just say, I know a lot of trans people who still use that word about themselves, and often it gets used to make a distinction between people who are interested in some kind of medicalized transition versus people who are not.
Because it pertains sex pertaining to like genital shape or
it's just
like that.
It's just I mean, some people just sort of continue to use it as a way of marking a certain kind of distinction within the broader, umbrella of transgender. And, I use the word about myself. So, it's like, I mean, I personally don't find it pejorative. But, you know, sometimes people can say things about themselves that, you know, other people should maybe refrain from. So, from using.
Right. Well, I would also say, like, sometimes it's like nobody's business what someone's morphology or what their actually like genital shape is, right? And it seems like some people get really interested in that and want to know. Like,
have you had the operation? It's like, I don't know. Why don't you tell me about your junk first? Yeah, it's like, can I see that? It's like, tell me. It's like, how have you felt about your genitals since you were a child?
Yeah,
you know?
right.
I really want to know. It's like,
can you hear yourself right now?
Right. So, but Christine Jorgensen is the person who called public attention to the possibilities of using hormones and surgery to like change your morphology, like your body shape, and to link that to this idea of, you know, a social transition of genders. Jorgensen was somebody who was born in like 1926, I believe, to Danish American parents in the Bronx, and always felt effeminate somehow. I think they had questions about whether they were gay or trans or what have you, and remember that they were a young person in the 30s and 40s. And
I think it was when they would say, like, you're probably gay. Like, if you're associating too much with women because you like boys, that means you're gay. Like, this is some of the thinking that they would go through.
Yeah. But, you know, Jorgensen self-educated herself on what was possible, and she sought out surgical and hormonal treatment in Europe because it wasn't really available in the U.S. in the early 1950s. And then when she transitioned, and she spent like a year and a half, 2 years living in Copenhagen and going through her social transition there. When she had surgery, it was leaked to the press and became this global media story. And if, you know, any of your listeners remember all of the hoopla, you know, a few years ago around Caitlyn Jenner coming out, I mean, just completely mediatized, cover of Vanity Fair, you know, ABC News, you know, 2020 with Diane Sawyer's doing a special, episode on this, you know, and you know, Caitlyn Jenner was just like all over the place for a hot minute there. And that was Christine Jorgensen in the 50s. Her news of her so-called sex change made headlines around the world. I mean, the first story was in I think it was the New York Post, but the headline says, "XGI becomes blonde beauty," you know, and that it just went viral, you know.
She looks like a classic beauty of that era.
Yeah, I mean, she looks,
you know, hair
when she's in her 20s, I mean, she looks like a young Marilyn Monroe. I mean, she definitely has the sort of like charisma and vivacity.
Do trans people, some look at that and kind of, is that a problem to say, wow, do we really have to code that much into these gender roles?
Yeah, you know, I think trans people code into their gender roles just like everybody else. I mean, like me personally, it's like, yeah, I feel like I'm like pretty androgynous, femme of center, but it's just like I am not a girly girl by any stretch of the imagination. But it's just like some people are, right? You know, it's just like some cis women are more androgynous.
Okay,
and it's
cool.
like that was who Jorgensen was. I mean, she could rock that little, you know, blonde starlet look. And she did, you know, and
was part of it that she needed to, though? Like, you bring up the fact that she felt pressure to perform goodness, for example. Like, she felt representative. She actually felt like, okay, I need to do good for other people. Like, I can be a representative.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely had that sense of like wanting to enact what I would call like a trans respectability, you know, that she definitely played against the, hi, I am a sleazy drag entertainer doing burlesque, and I'm a street walking drag queen. You know, it's just like she, you know, and I would just say like no shade to people who do that work, you know, just like sisters. But Jorgensen was trying to perform a kind of like middle class white, gender normative so-called respectability, and trying to distance herself from any kind of subcultural expression of gender variance, for sure. but that she, I don't think she anticipated the level of fame that she would achieve when her story was leaked to the press. She was actually trained as a photographer. She wanted to be a documentary filmmaker. She had worked in Hollywood as a set photographer. She was working at RKO Studios in the newsreels division as a film cutter. It was the last job she had before she went off to Copenhagen. And she said she was not expecting to become a celebrity at all. But once the story went viral, she really was not able to do anything else. It was kind of well, it's I'm outed as trans. I'm exoticized. I'm sexualized. It's I'm not finding any other work. It's guess I better develop a nightclub routine and, get out there and hoof it and support my aging parents and keep a roof over my head and do all. And so she did. And I would say she rose to the occasion, that she became a successful performer and entertainer in the 50s, from 53, 54 up through about, 63, 64 for about a decade. She was making $5,000 a week out on the nightclub circuit. And that's a nice chunk of change even now. It was a lot of money back in the 50s and early 60s. But it was through Jorgensen that the concept, it's like here's what science can do for you. And there was an awful lot of I sort of would call it the technological sublime, there was all of this post-World War II, enthusiasm about science. It was we can split the atom and we can put rockets in outer space and we're on the way to the moon. It's and look, we can turn a man into a woman or a woman into a man. And
marshmallows were invented, a food revolution of all this sort of
radar, plastics,
Yes.
All of this. So Jorgensen kind of was, I think of her like an avatar. She was the avatar of this post 20th century moment of technological enthusiasm and the idea that humanity itself could be transformed through scientific innovation. And so, Jorgensen was the poster girl for all of that.
It was eye-opening to see as well that sometimes surgery has been seen as a radical progressive move, wow, they're changing their bodies, but also it could be a conservative solution to homophobia, where it's oh, actually, we're going to change bodies to align with this person so that they're not gay or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think that was definitely part of the fascination with Jorgensen, because she, before transition, it's I think was widely perceived as a effeminate gay man, the way she got mediatized, with that XGI becomes blonde beauty. It's there's this idea of Jorgensen was some virile gung-ho combat veteran in World War II.
Right.
In truth, she got drafted, at the end of the war, and she was assigned mostly to Fort Dix, New Jersey.
Yeah, well, that's not a great story, though.
Right.
That's not a front page headline. We've really got to play up the
98-pound weakling military clerk, decides to, blah, blah, blah. So,
right.
So yeah, the copy just, was wasn't headline worthy. But this sense of Jorgensen being the, manly G.I. Joe type who gets turned into, Marilyn Monroe. That's sort of the cultural fantasy at work there. I think a lot of it has to do with, as you were just saying, cultural fears of homophobia. It's there was heightened attention in the post-World War II years to particularly male homosexuality. It had become much more visible during the war years for a variety of reasons we could go into if you want. But
the book certainly does. People can check it out.
Right. And that it was homosexuality, what to do about this? It's science, engineering. It's
that was the time,
yeah, we can make that boy who likes boys a girl. It's
right.
Whew, problem solved. So,
and it's important. This is why it's important, as you laid out at the outset, that sex, gender, and sexuality are three different things. Gender identity being kind of more cultural, sex being more biological, and sexuality being what people are attracted to or turned on by. And those are all different variables. And over time, psychologists and just everyday people have come to terms with that more and more. To skip ahead here a little bit, your book looks at social conditions, and it's not just about individual people who transition or individual experiences. And I was really... I was not expecting to see some of the infighting or some of the struggles that went on within what we now call the LGBTQ plus community. That's just a thing we have today. But it wasn't always that way. And there were some alliances, but there were also some divisions. And I'm thinking, for example, of Stonewall as a famous instance, this protest that happened there against police. And trans people were a big part of that. But now it's associated in the popular imagination more with gay people, with gay men in particular, right? So maybe spend a minute just talking about kind of the activism side of things and how there were different alliances that took shape over time.
The thing that I would say is that if we look back historically into the late 19th and early 20th century, the most common way of thinking about sexuality and gender variance, I think, among both variant people themselves as well as medical and legal forensic authorities, was to think about not like homosexuality and heterosexuality, that kind of wasn't the framework yet, but to think about inverts and normal people, and the idea of the psychosexual invert who is attracted to a so-called normal person of their same biological sex. It's like that was the predominant way of thinking about things, so that it kind of conflates the idea of sexual orientation and gender identity, the way that we've come to make that distinction post-World War II. But the idea of a female person who is in love with a female person, well, one of them's going to be a normal woman and the other one's going to be an invert, and that they might just be a little bit inverted in terms of like, liking a woman is something that men do, and so like that's a little bit of a gender inversion there, but maybe they're even more inverted, and that they like wear pants instead of dresses or like to cut their hair short. It's like, but then there could be somebody who's like really super inverted, like actually thinks they're a member of the other sex or like trying to pass as a member of that gender or wanting to change their bodies, so that the invert normal model puts trans and gay kind of on the same side of the question. It's like they're kind of like they're conflated. They're both expressions of the same thing. And it's really not until you develop this new sex gender identity model post World War II that I think that gay and trans people really start thinking of themselves as like fundamentally different kinds of people. And that once you have that, I think that what we would now call like, cisgender gay and lesbian identities, they were really unaware of what we would now call their cisgender privilege and would try to distance themselves from, those more sick, more pathological, freakier trans people who are not like us, and that's not what we are doing. And that I would argue that the progress that was made on gay and lesbian rights in the post-World War II period, particularly in the 60s and 70s, was predicated on ways that gay and lesbian people shared with straight people their cisgender privilege, and they kind of threw trans people under the bus. And you can really see it in the social history of LGBT social activism in the 60s and 70s. You mentioned Stonewall. It's like, oh, it was gay men rioting. It's like, well, yeah, gay men did riot, but the instigation of that event was the harassment of gender variant people of color on the streets outside the bar, right. And so, I mean, Stonewall is so mythologized as a point of origin. It's a very complex record of what happened there, but I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the spark for resisting police violence, resisting any kind of clampdown on trans and gay spaces, it usually revolves around the way that like trans feminine people engaged in sex work on the street are targeted by the police. It's like that is the most common instigation of anti-queer violence. It's like it is the point of origin of all of the resistance movements that have taken place over the last half century and more.
Another division that your book draws out is between feminism and transgender issues. And I was struck with how much the 70s parallels what's happening today, where we have feminism really, really flourishing, but then you have feminists who say, well, not trans people, not especially trans women. And, we're seeing that same thing today with people like J.K. Rowling and this TERF identity, trans exclusionary radical feminists who say, nope, the only women that count are defined in this particular way. And it really parallels more with what was happening in the 70s than I would have realized.
Yeah. Well, I would say it not just parallels it, but that the ideas that have really taken off since about 2014, 2015, it's like, it's not that they parallel the 70s, it's like it comes out of the 70s. It's like it's some of the exact same people, and that there's a fascinating history there to look at how certain kinds of transphobic discourses emerge in certain very specific pockets of lesbian feminist separatism in the late 60s and early 70s, and how those ideas migrate out of those very marginalized cultural spaces kind of more into the mainstream, how it moves into international human rights discourses, particularly around sex trafficking, and then the way that it starts to get folded in with right-wing ethno-nationalist, populist movements, other kinds of reactionary populist politics with fundamentalist Catholicism and evangelicalism. I mean, I would call that like transphobia studies. Like there is a tremendous story to be told there about how that all went down. But these ideas that are experiencing such a resurgence right now emerged 50 years ago. It's not a parallel, it's a continuation.
As you're writing this part of the book, we're kind of getting later into the book, into the 90s and stuff. You talk about how the American Psychiatric Association changed over time thanks to lobbying and input from specialists, but also trans people and others. Gender identity disorder was finally removed from the DSM in 2013, which actually seems really kind of recent for that. Yeah. But as you're writing the history of this, did it line up with your own memories of what was going on back then? Or was it like, oh, wow, there was a lot more here than what I realized at the time?
I'll answer that, but I also just want to circle back to the feminism question for a moment and just say, like, I consider myself a feminist. I teach in gender studies programs, or at least I did until I retired. I feel like feminism is something that is in alignment with anti-racist practices and support of indigenous sovereignty movements, and that it's in alignment with struggles for economic justice as well as like bodily autonomy. It's just like, for me, it is a wholly positive word, but I also recognize that there are many kinds of feminisms, that it's not monolithic. There are some feminisms that I think are actually quite pernicious, and I don't mind calling them out. But I also just really want to highlight, I don't want to conflate the idea of transphobia with feminism, because most feminists, in my experience, are not transphobic.
Yeah, even back then, there was that transgender woman who was the folk singer that was at the
Beth Elliott
event. Yeah, and like they had the vote to see, should we kick her out? And then most people said no, but then the people in charge are like, no, we're still going to do it. Like, so you even showed, even back then, there was like most of the feminists at that time were supportive, but the people that had the levers of power were like, nope, you're out of here.
There was just a really mobilized base, to use our current terms, that even though most feminists were trans inclusive, it's like I would say only some of them were like, yes, we must do this. Others were kind of like, I haven't really thought about this a whole lot, but no big deal to me. And then there was this minority that was just like, no, these people are like evil Nazi constructed fembots who are trying to destroy our movement from within.
And they're actually the patriarchy. They're coming, it's stolen valor too. That's this idea of like, hey, you can't be a woman because we've paid our dues, you haven't.
Right, exactly. And so that was always the minority, but they were a very persistent minority.
Do you get the sense that's how it is today still then within feminism in general?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
There's definitely a fire, but there's a lot more smoke than fire. That's what I would say. But your other question about...
Your experience in the 90s, It was basically like, if you're writing this history and you're like, oh, wow, I did not know that was going on.
All right. Well, so I would say if it's something that happened in the 80s and after, which is a long time now, it's things that I was aware of at the time because, by that time I was an adult. In the 80s, I was really wrestling with to transition, how to transition, blah, blah, blah. But I was, definitely kind of part of conversations with people, outside my head and, was part of communities, part of social networks, certainly paying attention to what was going on in the news. But then by the 90s, it's like when I transitioned, it's like, I was, living at 24/7, 365. And I kind of joke about it. Half funny kind of way of saying there's only one job that the world lets most trans women have, and that is to figure out how to get other people to pay them for being a trans woman. And you can figure out lots of ways to get paid for being a trans woman, and I've gotten paid in lots of ways, for being a trans woman. But it's I thought, this is it. It's just I get reduced to this one thing. It's I'm not a person who comes from this part of the country. I'm not a person who has this social or religious background. It's I'm not a person who has a family. I'm not a person who has interests or expertise or whatever. I'm a transsexual woman. It's that's, that is the door that I have to go through in every interaction with the world. So, it's dance with who brung you to the ball, it's just that's the horse I need to ride in on. And so how many different things can I make trans do?
I want people to know as we're talking about this too, we focused a lot on being on trans women issues and things. The book itself is much broader, talks a lot more about race, about trans men. It's very intersectional. So people that are listening to this interview, if they haven't got that impression yet or wondering what's up with that, that's kind of my own thing as an interviewer, could have done better at that. But I do want people to know the book itself definitely is more expansive on that. And the book itself has also been updated. It was originally published in 2008, needed big updates. After 10 years, you've released a second edition. And I just wanted to conclude really quick with a word about kind of the state of affairs right now. How are you feeling right now about the lay of the land? You've mentioned a few things. We're seeing legislatures doing things, et cetera. So just maybe a word of advice for people that are concerned about these issues today.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. All right. Well, I'll just say I just tried to have a very broad spectrum attention to trans issues from the 90s forward. So I feel like things that I write about in the book from the 90s, the aughts, the teens are things that I've been directly involved in as an activist, artist, filmmaker, scholar, what have you. I definitely felt like the first edition of the book, it was basically reflecting on what had happened in the 20th century, that it positioned the 90s as a sort of a watershed moment where you had these new ideas about transness coming out. It needed to be updated to account for what happened after 9/11, because that was kind of about the time the first book came out and the sort of end of the first decade of the 21st century. Because there was a tremendous amount of progress for at least fairly privileged trans people in the Obama years, from 2008 to 2016. And, the second edition of the book came out right when Trump was elected. And that was, if you want to talk about a watershed, that was a watershed event. I think that was the thing that slaps people upside the head with the idea that history is not a progress narrative, and that I think I'm going to have to do a third edition of the book now, to account for what's happened, since 2016. because it's just not pretty, and it's totally important. And who would have thought that trans issues would be one of the frontline issues in the contemporary culture wars? But here we are.
And with all of that, too, I'll just conclude by saying your book isn't just about the struggles, the fights, the legal implications, etc., but you also spend time on the joy and the art and the cultural efflorescence. So there's joy in this book as well, and it's a wonderful story. It gets a lot. There's a lot on the table here for people to chew on. So I appreciate you writing it. We need to take a quick break, but that's Susan Stryker, author of Transgender History: The Roots of Today's Revolution, and we'll be right back with a best book recommendation.
Hi, I'm Caroline Klein. I've spent the last 7 years listening to Latter-day Saint women from around the world discuss their hopes and fears, their sorrows and joys, and the ways their faith informs their everyday lives. I want to share their stories and voices with you on my new podcast, This Global Latter-day Life. Join me to hear about the perspectives and life stories of Latter-day Saints from places like Botswana, Mexico, the Caribbean, and other countries around the world. Each of the women you'll meet contributed their stories to Claremont Graduate University's Mormon Oral History collections. We'll also be joined by scholars and other community members who offer insights and explore questions that arise along the way. Half storytelling, half conversation, This Global Latter-day Life amplifies the voices of global church members and invites all of us to take more seriously the perspectives of Latter-day Saints navigating diverse cultures. Subscribe wherever you find your podcasts.
Hey, it's Blair Hodges, taking a moment here to stir up the coals, get the flames going a little bit longer for the rest of the interview. As it winds down, I wanted to read something from a listener that came in through the contact form on the website. This is from Darren H., and Darren says they wish they sent this message a long time ago. They're a long-time listener and enjoyed the first season of Fireside. And this is funny, Darren's email came in just a couple days before Season 2 debuted, and Darren says, I understand life and day jobs and families go through different seasons of busyness, but I hope that I'll have the opportunity to listen to more of your good work, whether that be Season 2 of Fireside or another project. Well, I mean, Darren was in luck. Just a few days later, Season 2 came out, so that was a timely message. Thanks for sending it, Darren. I appreciated hearing from you and hearing about your feelings about the show. You can contact me. Just go on the website. There's a contact form. You can also email me, blair@firesidepod.org. Interact on social media. I don't get a lot of traffic there, so it would be great to hear from people. Also, rating and reviewing is a big deal, so if you use Apple Podcasts, just go search Fireside, go to the show page, and you'll be able to rate and review it there and leave some thoughts. I really appreciate every single review that comes in. All right, let's get back to the show. We're back with Susan Stryker, author of the book Transgender History: The Roots of Today's Revolution. All right, Susan, it's your turn now. It's best books time. What did you bring to recommend to us?
I brought one of my favorite novels of recent years, and since we're talking about trans stuff, it's a book with a trans theme in it, and that book is Confessions of the Fox by Jordi Rosenberg. It's a novel that revolves around, I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but it revolves around a trans guy who's an English professor at a small college in New England who thinks he has discovered a lost 18th century manuscript about this guy named Jack Shepherd, who was a historical figure, who was the historical basis for the Mac the Knife character in Three Penny Opera, and that apparently Jack Shepherd was a transmasculine person. You know, that's the made-up part. So Confessions of the Fox purports to be this rediscovered manuscript that is being annotated by this scholar, a trans guy, and the footnotes are hilarious. It's just like the conversation that goes on between the narrator and the character. It's like Jack Shepherd has got his, girlfriend Bess, and the professor who's annotating is like, oh my god, that's just so like my relationship with my girlfriend. Let me tell you about this thing. And so you start to see the two stories between the scholar and the historical character paralleling each other. And I will just say it is one of the most inventive, funny, sexy, smart books I have read in recent years. I have taught seminars on this book. Students love it. It has so many little rabbit holes to go down. If you like transgender history, this is a book that sort of makes the most of like telling weird stories about trans history that you never thought of, and yet weaving it into a speculative historical novel. It's 5 stars, highest possible recommendation.
I haven't heard of this. It's been critically hailed. It's won Book of the Year by New Yorker, Kirkus Reviews. This looks like a really fun book.
Yeah, it's super fun.
Well, cool. Hey, I wish we had way more time because we barely scratched the surface today, Susan, and this has been a really enjoyable conversation with you. I really appreciate you meeting here at Fireside and just talking about yourself and your research.
Sure, happy to do it, and, have me back anytime.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
We need part 2 and part 3, so.
All right. Well, just hit me
All right,
up.
thanks a lot.
All right.
Fireside with Blair Hodges is sponsored by the Howard W. Hunter Foundation, supporters of the Mormon Studies program at Claremont Graduate University in California. It's also supported by the Dialogue Foundation, a proud part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. All right, another episode's in the books. The fire has dimmed, but the discussion continues. Join me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at PodFireside, and I'm on Facebook as well. You can leave a comment at firesidepod.org. You can also email me questions, comments, or suggestions directly. The address is blair@firesidepod.org, and please don't forget to rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts if you haven't already. Fireside is recorded, produced, and edited by me, Blair Hodges, in Salt Lake City. Special thanks to my production assistants, Kate Davis and Camille Messick, and also thanks to Christy Franson, Matthew Bowman, and Kristen Ulrich Hodges. The opening theme song is called Great Light by Deep Sea Diver. You can check out that excellent band at thisisdeepseadiver.com. Fireside with Blair Hodges is the place to fan the flames of your curiosity about life, faith, culture, and more. See you next time.